The morning begins slowly, under a veil of pale London light that slips through the heavy curtains of a quiet Victorian home. The air feels still, touched by the faint scent of coal and tea leaves. Downstairs, a servant moves softly, careful not to let her footsteps echo across the polished floorboards. In this world, even the sound of waking was governed by unspoken laws. The household must rise gracefully, not hurriedly, for rushing was the mark of disorder, and disorder was a kind of moral failing. The master of the house stirs, not from the sunlight, but from the gentle knock of the maid. She announces that his breakfast is ready, her voice barely above a whisper. In the Victorian age, silence was a form of respect, and humility a daily duty. A gentleman's morning began not with freedom, but with routine, each movement rehearsed, each gesture polite. He dresses in layers of neatly pressed garments, each symbolizing his place in society. A polished watch, a clean collar, and freshly shined boots. These were more than clothing. They were proof of one's self-control, evidence that a man lived by rules. For the Victorians, appearances were a kind of moral compass, guiding how one must be seen, even within the walls of their own home. Downstairs, the lady of the house sits quietly at the breakfast table, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She speaks softly, only when spoken to, and smiles with precision, polite, but never too warm. The children, if they are present, are to be calm and still, never interrupting the quiet order of the meal. The clinking of silverware becomes the only sound, filling the silence with rhythm. Outside, carriages begin to roll across the cobblestone streets. A faint hum of life seeps into the home, distant footsteps, a paper boy's call, the toll of a nearby church bell. Yet even the city's chaos cannot touch the ritual of the morning. Within these walls, control reigns supreme. To live in Victorian society was to perform every day, even before an invisible audience. Every action, no matter how small, how one greeted a servant, how one folded a napkin, how one breathed before speaking, all were bound by the quiet chains of propriety. It was a life measured not by joy or comfort, but by restraint. And as the morning light grows brighter, it reveals a truth beneath the calm, that beneath the surface of politeness lies exhaustion. For to live by such rules is to constantly guard oneself, to smile without warmth, to speak without honesty, to exist without freedom. The Victorian morning, though beautiful in its order, was heavy with invisible weight. A day begun in silence, destined to end the same way, with quiet, perfection, and the careful suppression of the self. Dressing in the Victorian era was not a simple act of choosing what to wear, it was a daily ritual of discipline, a performance that reflected one's place in the moral order of society. The bedroom, filled with dim morning light, became a quiet stage where identity was stitched together layer by layer. A lady's maid entered with a calm expression, carrying garments neatly folded and perfumed with lavender. Each article of clothing had its meaning, and each layer a purpose beyond mere warmth or beauty. For women, the first layer was always modesty, linen chemises, and long stockings drawn carefully up the legs. Then came the corset, drawn tight by the maid's skilled hands until the ribs ached and breath came shallow. The pain was expected, even admired, for it symbolized control and refinement. A straight posture and a small waist were more than signs of beauty. They were signs of virtue. The corset reminded every woman that to be admired, she must endure quietly. Over this foundation came the petticoats, the bodice, and finally the outer gown, often of heavy fabric and subdued color. Bright hues were reserved for the young or for the foolish. A proper woman's clothing spoke of dignity, restraint, and respectability. Her gloves, always pristine, hid her hands from view. The body was not to be revealed but suggested, the self always hidden beneath civility. For men, the ritual was no less demanding. They began with crisp shirts and stiff collars that scratched the neck if not perfectly aligned. Waistcoats, tailored coats, polished boots, each item had to be spotless. For even a wrinkle or a loose thread could suggest carelessness. The cravat was tied with precision, the pocket watch gleamed, and a faint scent of soap replaced any trace of sweat or labor. A true gentleman appeared as if untouched by the physical world, his composure unbroken by the struggles of ordinary life. Mirror gazing was not vanity, it was duty. The reflection was not a person but a social mask, the image that would face the scrutiny of others. Behind the composed expressions lay discomfort, sometimes pain, but it was hidden beneath fine fabric and polite posture. In the Victorian world, to appear comfortable was almost vulgar. Suffering silently was a form of grace. By the time the dressing was complete, both men and women had armored themselves in etiquette. Their movements were restricted by fashion, but that restriction itself became the symbol of refinement. Every fold of fabric carried expectation. Every button fastened another boundary. And so they stepped into their day, elegant, polished, breath-constrained, bound by threads that held not only their clothes but their very lives in place. In this world, decency was stitched as tightly as a corset, and the simple act of dressing became an unspoken promise to uphold the invisible rules that governed Victorian respectability. Breakfast in a Victorian home was more than a meal, it was a ceremony of manners, a quiet rehearsal of social grace before the world began to watch. The table was carefully set before dawn. Silver utensils glimmered faintly in the pale light, and porcelain dishes bore delicate floral patterns imported from faraway lands. The arrangement itself was a reflection of order, the same kind of order that ruled the lives of those who sat around it. The master of the house entered first, dressed impeccably, his presence both calm and commanding. The lady followed, gliding softly across the carpet, her movements measured and elegant. Even the way she sat was bound by instruction, the back straight, chin level, hands resting lightly on her lap. Servants moved in silence, placing toast and tea before them, the clink of china breaking the stillness for only a moment before fading again into quiet. Conversation began, but never too quickly. It was expected that words, like everything else, should move at a polite pace. The topics were predictable: the weather, the latest news from the paper, perhaps a polite remark about a friend's dinner party. No one mentioned business at breakfast. To discuss money was coarse. Personal feelings, frustrations, or desires were unthinkable. Speech was not for honesty, but for harmony. Children, if present, were expected to be seen but not heard. They sat upright, practicing the same poised stillness their parents displayed. A dropped spoon or an unguarded laugh could bring a quiet, disapproving glance, not anger, just the gentle reminder that discipline must begin early. The morning meal was a lesson in control, repeated every day until it became second nature. Every word was chosen, every smile deliberate. A misplaced tone could imply arrogance, a prolonged silence could seem cold. The Victorians lived in fear of misinterpretation, and breakfast, though calm and civil, was a battlefield of impression. Underneath the soft voices, tension hummed like a quiet string, the constant awareness of how one must appear. After the meal, the servants cleared the table swiftly, their presence acknowledged only through brief nods. A thank you was seldom spoken aloud. Gratitude was shown through expectation, not words. The master folded his newspaper neatly, the lady rose with a faint smile, and together they retreated to their daily routines, he to his study, she to her parlor or charitable duties. The house returned to its silence, the sound of their departure leaving behind an emptiness both peaceful and heavy. In that silence lived the essence of Victorian life: composure over comfort, manners over warmth. Even the simple act of breakfast was shaped by invisible boundaries, where civility was not kindness, but armor. It was a quiet, graceful performance that began each day, polished, polite, and profoundly lonely. Stepping outside into the streets of Victorian London was like entering a grand stage where every person played a part, and every action was judged. The cobblestones were slick from the morning rain, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp horsehair. Carriages rolled steadily through the fog, their wheels clattering in rhythm with the steady beat of footsteps. A city alive, but restrained. For all its noise and motion, London in the Victorian age was bound by silence of another kind, the silence of social rules. A gentleman never hurried, no matter how late he was. He walked with purpose, but never haste, his gloved hands neatly clasped behind his back or tucked around a cane. Each movement spoke of control, of self-possession. If he passed an acquaintance, he would tip his hat with a precise gesture, a motion rehearsed and executed like a ritual. To forget such a courtesy was not merely rude. It hinted at moral decay. A lady, if she ventured out, was expected to do so with caution and always with a companion. To walk alone, even in daylight, could stain her reputation beyond repair. Her gaze was modest, her steps small and deliberate, her posture an unspoken declaration of virtue. The streets were lined with eyes, and every glance, every whisper carried weight. Respectability was as fragile as lace once torn, impossible to mend. The poor, though they filled most of the city, existed in the background of polite society. A gentleman might avert his eyes from a beggar, not out of cruelty, but because acknowledging suffering was considered improper. Pity was to be expressed through donations, not emotion. The presence of poverty was an inconvenience, a reminder that beneath the elegant facades, The city was built on struggle. Street etiquette governed every interaction. To speak too loudly was crude. To laugh openly was worse. Even the act of crossing the road followed a rhythm of deference and timing. There was no chaos, only choreography, a world moving in patterns, each person aware of their place in it. A brush of the shoulder, an unguarded glance, or a word spoken out of turn could ripple through the delicate web of reputation that held Victorian society together. And yet, behind this careful order, there was unease. The rules promised dignity but delivered distance. No one truly saw one another. They saw only what was proper. The city bustled with thousands of lives lived under quiet restraint, where politeness was protection and individuality a risk. As the afternoon sun broke weakly through the London fog, its light revealed the truth of it all, the beauty and the burden of civility. In the Victorian street, one did not simply walk, one performed, always aware that somewhere, someone was watching. And so they moved calm, silent, perfect, each step a lesson in how to disappear behind good manners. Love in the Victorian era was not a matter of passion but of performance, bound tightly by rules as unyielding as the corsets women wore and the stiff collars men endured. It was a quiet, delicate ritual played out through glances, letters, and silences, a romance defined not by what was said, but by what was never spoken aloud. To fall in love was not to surrender but to behave, to navigate an invisible maze of etiquette where every gesture carried meaning and every mistake could ruin a life. In the golden glow of a candlelit ballroom, a young woman might catch the eye of a gentleman across the room. The orchestra played softly, lace and silk rustled as dancers glided across the floor. Their eyes met for a moment, only a moment, but in that world, a glance could carry the weight of a confession. He could not speak to her without a proper introduction, and she could not show too much interest without risking her reputation. The courtship began with silence. A gentleman might call upon her family, his arrival announced by the servant. He would leave his card, and if the lady's family approved, an invitation might be extended. The meetings that followed were brief, always supervised, and always public. Their words floated between safe topics, music, literature, the weather, but beneath those polite exchanges, emotions trembled. Love was not free. It was filtered through rules that demanded grace over honesty. Letters became their secret lifeline, written in careful script, sealed with wax, and delivered discreetly. Each word had to balance tenderness with propriety. A letter to forward could end everything. Instead of "I love you," one might write, "Your absence is most keenly felt." Every sentence was wrapped in restraint, yet between the lines lay the beating heart of longing. The Victorians spoke softly, but they felt deeply. Public affection was forbidden. A brush of fingers while handing over a teacup could send a jolt through the soul, yet it had to be disguised as accident. To be seen walking too closely together could invite scandal. Even once engaged, lovers were expected to remain reserved, their love expressed through symbols rather than touch. A flower pressed into a book, a handkerchief scented with perfume, a shared glance across a crowded room. These were their declarations. For women especially, the stakes were immense. A single rumor could destroy her chances of marriage, her reputation, her life. Love had to be pure, or at least appear so. Men were bound by fewer rules, but even they lived under the watchful eye of propriety. A hasty engagement, a misplaced compliment, could mark them as reckless or unrefined. And so, romance unfolded quietly behind fans, within letters, through eyes that spoke more than words ever could. It was love built on patience, shaped by fear, and softened by longing. To love in the Victorian world was to ache beautifully, to yearn within boundaries, and to carry one's heart not on the sleeve, but hidden beneath layers of silk and silence. The parlor was the beating heart of every respectable Victorian home, a room not for comfort, but for presentation. It was where a family's reputation was displayed, where visitors were received, and where every conversation, gesture, and decoration spoke in silent tones of status. Stepping into a parlor was like entering a carefully arranged performance. The air was still, scented faintly with polished wood and dried flowers, and the light filtered gently through lace curtains, illuminating every chosen detail. The furniture stood in deliberate order, the sofa centered before the hearth, two high-backed chairs positioned for conversation, a piano against the far wall, and perhaps a display cabinet filled with porcelain figurines or seashells collected from seaside holidays. Every object had meaning, not only aesthetic, but moral. A tidy parlor suggested a tidy mind, a reflection of good upbringing and self-control. Dust or clutter was unthinkable, for untidiness hinted at weakness of character. Here, the lady of the house, ruled supreme. It was her domain, her proof of taste and gentility. Her embroidery lay neatly on a side table, not because she had just worked on it, but because it showed diligence and refinement. Books rested in a small stack nearby, chosen carefully, never too radical, never too worldly. A volume of poetry, a Bible, perhaps a travelogue or moral essay, all safe choices that conveyed intellect without rebellion. Visitors were received according to their place in society. When guests arrived, the servant announced them, and the hostess greeted them with a smile, so practiced it seemed effortless. Conversation followed the rhythm of civility, a gentle exchange of compliments, soft laughter, and inquiries about health or weather. There were rules even for the length of a visit. Too short could seem dismissive, too long could appear impolite. Everything existed within a precise balance. Tea was served with elegance, the clink of porcelain, the slow pour, the offer of sugar with delicate tongs. No one drank before the hostess lifted her cup, and even then, small sips were taken between polite remarks. Topics such as politics, religion, or money were avoided. Instead, art, travel, and morality were safe grounds. The goal was not truth but harmony, a smooth exchange that left no ripple of discomfort. Children were rarely permitted in the parlor unless visitors were family. When they were, they sat quietly, hands folded, eyes downcast, learning the art of appearing composed. Even laughter had rules. Too loud was childish, too quiet was cold. Everything was measured, restrained, graceful. When guests departed, the hostess returned to her silence, inspecting the room for any small imperfection left behind. The parlor returned to stillness, every cushion plumped, every object precisely as it had been. It was beautiful, yes, but lifeless, a shrine to propriety. In truth, the parlor was less a room for living and more a mirror for the world to gaze upon. It reflected the values of its time, discipline, modesty, control, and behind that perfection lay the loneliness of a life too well-mannered to be free. The parlor was the heart of Victorian respectability, but it was also a cage draped in velvet. Dinner in the Victorian era was not merely a meal, it was a ceremony, a silent play of manners and social hierarchy performed beneath the soft glow of candlelight. The dining room itself was a stage, its long polished table gleaming with silver cutlery and crystal glasses, its air filled with the faint scent of roasted meats and perfume. Every sound, the clink of forks, the murmur of polite conversation, the gentle rustle of fabric, contributed to an atmosphere of control and elegance. The evening began with a ritual. The gentleman escorted the ladies to the table, offering an arm with just the right degree of formality. Seating was never random. It reflected one's social standing, with the most honored guests placed closest to the host and hostess. Even in private homes, this order mattered. It was not enough to eat well, one had to behave beautifully. Once seated, everyone waited for the hostess to lift her napkin first, signaling that the meal could begin. Servants moved like shadows, silent and precise, filling glasses and presenting each dish with choreographed grace. Conversation flowed in soft tones, never about politics, religion, or money, but about books, art, weather, or distant travels. A good conversationalist was admired as much as a fine meal. Every gesture was dictated by etiquette. One did not lean too close to the plate, nor cut bread with a knife. Soup was sipped from the side of the spoon. Never slurp to rest one's elbows on the table was scandalous. To speak too loudly, unforgivable. Women ate slowly, gracefully, taking care to appear delicate and refined, while men were expected to display moderation and courtesy. Between courses, servants cleared the table in silence. Platters of roasted beef, game pies, and steamed puddings appeared one after another, symbols of abundance, yet also of order. The Victorians measured their success by how calmly they displayed wealth. Gluttony was frowned upon. Restraint was admired. It was not what you ate that mattered, but how. Toward the end of the meal, as the last crumbs of dessert were brushed away, the conversation often softened. Candles flickered lower, wine glasses caught the amber light. Gentle laughter filled the room, polite, never raucous. When the hostess finally rose, everyone followed. The ladies would withdraw to the parlor for tea, leaving the men to their cigars and quiet talk. Behind all the grace, however, there was tension. Every person at the table was aware of being watched, judged by family, by guests, by society itself. A misplaced word, a wrong fork, a careless gesture could reveal too much or too little breeding. The dinner table was a battlefield disguised as civility. As the candles burned low and the night grew still, the performance ended. the guests left with practiced smiles and rehearsed goodbyes. The table, once alive with ritual and restraint, now stood empty, a perfect echo of Victorian life itself, polished, orderly, and quietly suffocating beneath the weight of appearances. Night in the Victorian home carried its own quiet ritual, steeped in restraint and solitude. After the final goodnights were spoken and the last candle extinguished downstairs, the household retreated into its private silences. Servants moved like ghosts through dark hallways, shutting doors softly, winding clocks, and drawing heavy drapes against the chill. Outside, the city lay veiled in fog and the distant clatter of carriage wheels faded into stillness. Inside, the night belonged to whispers and thoughts too private for daylight. For a proper Victorian family, bedtime was no casual affair. Even rest was structured, measured by routine and modesty. The lady of the house would retire first, her maid helping her out of her corset, layer by layer, until she could finally breathe freely for the first time that day. The fire would be tended one last time before the room grew cold, and the shadows of the lace curtains stretched long across the floor. She might sit by the dim light of an oil lamp, brushing her hair exactly 100 times, a ritual of beauty, but also of order, before carefully pinning it up for the night. Her husband, in another room or perhaps the adjoining chamber, would sit quietly in an armchair, reading the evening paper or a book of moral essays before sleep. The ticking of the clock was loud in the silence, and every sound in the still house carried the creak of a floorboard, the faint rattle of the wind against the window panes. For many, this hour was one of reflection, a time to think about propriety, reputation, and duty. The mind could wander, but only so far. Even in solitude, restraint remained. Children were tucked into bed earlier, often in shared rooms under thick quilts. Their dreams were watched over by flickering candlelight and the faint smell of lavender or coal smoke. They were taught early that stillness was virtue, that to speak too much or move too freely was impolite. Even sleep had to appear graceful. For the servants, night was not always rest. They prepared for the next day, polishing shoes, mending clothes, arranging the breakfast table before retreating to their modest quarters. Their lives followed the same rhythm of quiet duty, but without the comfort of luxury. The great house might sleep, but its lower rooms still hummed with quiet labor. Outside, the streets belonged to another world, the poor, the desperate, and the restless. Gas lamps glowed dimly through the fog, and the sound of boots on cobblestones echoed faintly in the distance. From her warm bed, a lady might hear it and shiver, pulling her blanket closer, comforted by the illusion of safety and order her home provided. The Victorian night was peaceful only on the surface. Beneath the silence, there was unease, a loneliness born of manners too strict to allow true warmth. In the dark, people were finally free from watchful eyes, yet still prisoners of expectation. And so, the city slept or pretended to, under layers of lace, smoke, and unspoken dreams. Morning returned slowly to the Victorian home, not with joy, but with duty. The first light slipped through lace curtains, soft and gray, revealing a world already in motion. Servants rose before dawn, their footsteps quiet on the wooden floors as they stoked fires, boiled water, and polished the silver. The house awakened in layers, from the silent stirrings of the kitchen to the soft ring of the breakfast bell that summoned the family from their dreams back into the order of the day. The lady of the house began her morning with precision. A maid would bring in warm water for washing, and the air filled with the faint scent of lavender soap. Dressing was an ordeal of patience. Corset, petticoats, bodice, and skirt, each layer tightened and arranged until her waist seemed impossibly small, her posture unyielding. Clothing was not comfort, but discipline. It was a daily reminder of her place in society, of how much could be endured for the sake of appearances. Her husband's morning was quieter but no less ritualistic. A valet laid out his suit, starched shirt, and freshly shined shoes. He dressed in silence, checked his pocket watch, and read the newspaper while sipping tea. The pages rustled softly as he scanned the headlines, stories of progress, empire, and invention, while ignoring the ones about poverty and protest. The world outside was changing, but inside these walls, tradition held fast. Breakfast was a formal affair. The family gathered in the dining room, sunlight filtering through high windows onto the polished table. A proper meal might include eggs, toast, porridge, and strong tea, but what mattered most was composure. The children were expected to sit straight and speak only when spoken to. Their day would soon begin with lessons in reading, writing, and moral instruction, all meant to shape them into the next generation of proper Victorians. Conversations over breakfast were polite and distant. the weather, the church service. The latest letter from a relative, safe topics that filled the air without ever revealing feeling. Even affection was measured. A father's nod, a mother's smile, small gestures of love wrapped in restraint. Emotion, like everything else, was to be controlled. Outside, the streets of London were already alive. Chimneys smoked, vendors shouted, horses clattered along cobblestones. But inside, the world remained calm, enclosed in its bubble of manners and modesty. The family's lives ran on invisible rails of expectation, rising, dressing, eating, speaking, all according to rules written not on paper, but in hearts trained from birth to obey. And so, the Victorian morning passed in quiet rhythm, a dance of order and ritual that gave meaning. 2 days that might otherwise have none. Beneath the surface calm, however, was a subtle weariness, the exhaustion of lives lived for appearances, not for themselves. The sun climbed higher, the world grew louder, but within those polished walls, time itself seemed to move politely, never daring to disturb the silence. As the day came to its quiet end, the Victorian household settled once more into the still rhythm of order and appearance. The lamps were lit, their warm glow softening the sharp edges of the day, and the smell of coal smoke and candle wax filled the rooms. Outside, the streets darkened beneath the fog, the sound of carriage wheels fading into distant echoes. Inside, everything returned to calm, every cushion straightened, every curtain drawn, every expression composed. Evening in a Victorian home was not for relaxation, but for reflection. For maintaining the illusion of perfect control until the last light died, the family gathered once again, perhaps in the drawing room or the library. The father might read aloud from a novel, something moral and proper, perhaps Dickens or Austen, while the mother sat nearby with her embroidery, her needle glinting in the lamplight. The children listened quietly, hands folded in their laps, learning not just the story, but the posture and patience expected of them. Conversation remained gentle, deliberate, and safe. Even at home, one never forgot the eyes of society. The air carried the quiet hum of civility, no raised voices, no laughter too loud. A sigh was the boldest rebellion. Every gesture, every glance remained bound by invisible chains of propriety. Yet beneath the silence, each person carried private thoughts, the dreams they could not speak of, the emotions they could not show. The walls of the house, so polished and proud, held secrets as tightly as they held heat. For many women, evening was the loneliest hour. The day's duties were done, the facade maintained, and now came the stillness, the moment when she might look into the mirror and see not a lady, but a person yearning for air. The corset still pinched, the silence still pressed against her chest. Even beauty was another form of restraint. Men, too, bore their quiet burdens. The pressure to appear strong, moral, and composed left little space for tenderness or truth. A gentleman who confessed to sadness or doubt would be seen as weak. So he smoked his cigar, read his paper, and retreated into thought, as the fire dimmed to embers. As the clock chimed the hour, the house grew still again. Servants extinguished lamps, drew curtains tight, and moved softly through the halls. The family said their goodnights with gentle nods and formal affection. Upstairs, the last sounds were of footsteps fading and doors quietly closing. And then came the silence, deep, perfect, and absolute. The silence of a world that had learned to hide every desire behind manners, every emotion behind a smile. Victorian life, for all its elegance, was a life lived in disguise, where order masked longing, and propriety became a prison. Behind the lace and the polished silver, beneath the calm tone and graceful gestures, were hearts that beat, quietly, for freedom.